Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Zoning for More Equitable Housing Options, Lessons from Charlottesville, Virginia, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in partnership with the Smart Growth Network and the Maryland chapter of the American Planning Association. My name is Jill Lemke, and I serve as Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning. I am also an active member of the Smart Growth Network Steering Committee. The Smart Growth Network is a national alliance of advocates, practitioners, policymakers, and local leaders working towards a shared vision for land use and infrastructure policies and actions that result in healthy, equitable, sustainable, and prosperous communities for all. In addition to hosting events and webinars, we provide information on effective planning, development, and preservation practices. Smart Growth Network website is undergoing a transition, so please stay tuned for updates. Today's webinar is one in a series of webinars hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on sustainable growth and planning-related topics. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with past webinars for viewing via the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov or by visiting our YouTube channel. Our website also provides valuable information on statewide planning initiatives, tools, and educational opportunities, including information on future webinars. We encourage you to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. It is important to note that the views expressed by the speakers are those of the speaker and not necessarily those of the Maryland Department of Planning, the state of Maryland, the Smart Growth Network, or the Maryland chapter of the APA. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits or 1 equity credit from the American Planning Association. To receive your credits, please visit the APA's website, planning.org, to log into your account and search for the name of today's event. You can also search for event number 9301170. Following the presentation, we will address as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by opening the Q&A tool in the Zoom control panel. Now I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. James Freeze is Deputy City Manager for Operations for the City of Charlottesville, Virginia, overseeing the Public Works, Planning, Housing, Utilities, and Transit departments. Prior to his role, he led the Neighborhood Development Services Department, the Planning and Development Department of the city. James has worked in planning in both Virginia and Massachusetts, leading many different planning and zoning projects, tackling issues of housing, transportation, economic development, downtown revitalization, and environmental quality. James holds a master's degree in planning from the University of Rhode Island and in environmental law from Vermont Law School. Jenny Koch is a principal planner with Roadside Harwell in Alexandria, Virginia. Much of her work at RHI involves long-term planning, community development, resilience, public engagement, and active transportation and transit. Jenny serves on the executive committee of the Sustainable Communities Division of the American Planning Association. She holds a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University and a Bachelor of Science from the University of Wisconsin. Jenny served as the consultant team project manager for the Seaville Plans Together project. Christy Dodson is an associate principal at Code Studio, leading the firm's Atlanta office. Her work focuses on creative zoning strategies that foster more equitable development outcomes. Christy relies on her experience managing adaptive reuse and urban infill projects to bring together high-level policy goals with practical implementation. She has authored codes adopted by communities across the country that are innovative, user-friendly, and responsive to the unique needs of each place. Christy holds master's degrees in city and regional planning and architecture from Georgia Institute of Technology. It is now my pleasure to introduce and turn it over to James. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. Good afternoon to everybody. So I'm going to kick us off. There we go. With just a little bit of context and background on our project. First off, for those who don't know where Charlottesville is, we are located about 2 hours south of DC and about an hour west of Richmond in central Virginia, foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and right at the southern gateway to Shenandoah National Park. We're a city of about 51,000 people in 10 square miles. Notably, University of Virginia is located here on the western side of the city. And for those who might be interested in visiting, perhaps after you've heard our presentation, we have a beautiful downtown area with a Lawrence Halpern designed downtown mall, well worth the visit. So our comprehensive plan process, or this overall process of comprehensive planning and rewriting our zoning ordinance, began in 2017, really as a relatively typical update of an existing comprehensive plan. Events of 2017, which I'll come back and touch to, though, changed course for the city. And by 2019, we had rebooted the entire process and rebranded it as C-Build Plans Together. First major work products of that project were completed in 2021 with an affordable housing plan, which we adopted in March of that year, and then the comprehensive plan that we adopted in November of that year. We then moved immediately into rewriting the zoning ordinance, the first major implementation project of both of those plans. That work began right in January of 2022, and by December of that year, we had adopted a brand new ordinance. This was the new Charlottesville Development Code, which is both zoning and subdivision merged into the same document. That code became effective on February 19th of this year. So we still we're right about 9 months into implementing that new code. But significantly, 2017 was a major year for the city. We had the Unite the Right rally in August of that year. And in many ways, that event really challenged the city's sense of itself. And coming in the midst of this conversation around land use and zoning, issues of housing and economic development, really caused the city to need to revisit how it was approaching this project and what our priorities were coming into comprehensive planning. In particular, we began to really, as a community, look at the history of the city and understand how race and land use, issues of zoning had kind of interrelated with each other. So we found things such as you find in many communities, the deed restrictions related to race in many subdivisions. And we had people mapping those outcomes, mapping racial covenants, mapping the nature of unequal distribution of infrastructure, those types of things across the city. We also started to understand the legal history of the city, including a 1912 city ordinance that effectively zoned the city by race, defining where people of white or black race could live within the city, and specifically that they could not live in the same neighborhoods. Now, many people probably know that by 1917, the Supreme Court had outlawed explicitly race-based zoning. But in 1929, the city came back with a traditional zoning ordinance that reinforced many of those lines that had been drawn under that previous 1912 ordinance. And by 1956, the city had adopted its what is now, or what had been our previous modern zoning that codified single-family zoning for large sections of the city. But also in 1956, we adopted a plan that led to the use of urban renewal in the city and the destruction of the Vinegar Hill neighborhood and other predominantly Black neighborhoods across the city. The other major issue that the city then was looking at in the beginning parts of this comprehensive planning process was the issue of housing, both supply and in particular the supply of affordable housing. Major finding from a 2015 study was that we had both an undersupply at the top end of the market and an undersupply at the bottom end of the market. And what we understand from that is when you have an undersupply at the top end of the market, those individuals, those households still move within the city, but they displace people from the more middle income housing supply that's available. And the same thing at the other end, people end up buying homes or renting homes that are more expensive than they have than they can necessarily afford. So the overall undersupply within the city was again a major finding early on. And then looking ahead, we could see that the city was experiencing, and city and the county together were experiencing robust growth pressures. Strong local economy meant that we were seeing a growth in the households attempting to move to the city of Charlottesville. We also found that with only 30% of the city's land area available for any development above a single family level, there was a limited land area on which new housing could be constructed. And we found that at that time, more than 2,700 renter households in the city were paying more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities together. So again, understanding that those folks who couldn't find housing that wasn't available at the lowest income levels of the city were being pushed into more expensive housing. Also notable, Weldon Cooper Center had shared with us that clearly as growth was not accommodated within the city, it was pushed out within the county. And what we're finding now is that even further, many people are having to move as much as an hour's drive away in order to access jobs here in the city. The other finding that Weldon Cooper shared with us was that while it's understood that the DC area is the most expensive housing market within the state of Virginia, Charlottesville was the second most expensive housing market within the state. And further, when you took into account incomes within the Charlottesville area, really Charlottesville was in fact the most expensive area within the city. There's a common phrase for people moving or living here in the Charlottesville area that we have Northern Virginia housing prices, but Central Virginia incomes, Central Virginia wages. So the challenge we were faced with as we came into this comprehensive planning process was how do we promote the creation of more affordable housing, particularly at the lowest income levels, and then how do we create opportunities for a range of housing choices in all neighborhoods of the city. And of course, this is a challenge that we know communities across the entire country are facing. There was a lot that we could learn from looking at how other communities were responding, and that information, those ideas were rolled into the effort that we then took with our team. So with that, I think I'm turning it over to Jenny.
Thanks. So as James alluded to, this is where the CVille plans together process comes in. Before we jump into it, I just want to note, there's only 3 of us on here today, but there was so many other firms and people and groups involved in this effort, and I'll mention some of them as I go through, but I want to make sure that's recognized, because as you'll see, this was an extensive process. So as James has mentioned, the CVille plans together process was a 3-part process. It included development of an affordable housing plan, a comprehensive plan update, and a new zoning ordinance. It's not typical to do all of these under one contract, but it was intentional and it led to a streamlined process because this whole team was involved throughout the process. We heard the feedback we got from the community, elected officials, and others, and that could all be used throughout the process. I want to talk a bit about engagement because obviously with a name like CVille Plans Together, we had a big emphasis on community engagement, but having planned a community kickoff for early 2020, we obviously found that we needed to adapt our process to reach folks. So this slide has a lot of words on it because we used a lot of strategies to try to reach people and get feedback. I won't read through all of them, but there's a few things I wanted to highlight. You've heard us say Seville Plans Together quite a few times. We created that brand at the beginning of the process, so that could help people tie together in their minds all three parts of this process, and they could sort of follow along and understand how one fed into the other. We had a dedicated steering committee for this process, and it shifted a bit throughout the multi-year project, but it was made up of city officials, city staff, advocates, developers, community members, and others, and they met many times throughout the process. We also used a peer engager program. There was, I think, maybe 4 or 5 folks who were community members who were paid to help attend pop-up events, conduct outreach to businesses and neighborhoods, facilitate meetings, and generally try to make sure that we were reaching as many people as we could. And then one other thing I want to point out is that during the early visioning process, like that early 2020 period, we had planned for a lot of smaller in-person meetings with food, sitting around a table, discussing. And obviously we couldn't do that. So we shifted those all online. I think we had about 25 small group conversations that we led with a variety of people. And during that same time, when we were struggling to reach folks, we were able to distribute this sort of visioning survey to start the process. It was online and available on paper, and we were able to partner with organizations like Cultivate Charlottesville and others who were on our steering committee and otherwise to get out, that survey to folks in a variety of ways, including, they distributed it at a food distribution using sort of a simplified version to get feedback. So we were able to adapt, and in the end, that early visioning process had, more than 1,000 people were involved. So that was great, a great way to start. As I mentioned, it was a really extensive effort. We don't have time to give it justice today. And I once again just want to credit the full team in the city and everyone who was involved because it really was a group effort to do this. And before I jump into the affordable housing plan, I want to note the website is still active. If you're interested in poking around, seeing materials we created, you just go to sevilleplans-together.com and everything should still be available. So I'm going to walk through the first 2 elements of the Seville Plans Together process at a pretty high level because we know this webinar is really focused on zoning. But to get to the zoning, we went through these earlier processes that really led to the recommendations that fed into these zoning concepts we'll be discussing. I want to note our team member HRNA is not on the webinar today, but they led the development of the affordable housing plan. The housing plan kicked off at the same time as the comprehensive plan, and that was on purpose. Doing that, we could ensure that the comp plan could respond to any related recommendations from the affordable housing plan. And it was about just a little over a year-long effort. There was extensive community and leadership engagement throughout this process you see outlined. But in the end, the affordable housing plan really set the stage for many of the housing and land use strategies that came to be in the comp plan. And it also helped us identify the vision, and the vision that was established for the local housing market was that we wanted a local housing market that's healthy, high quality, affordable, and equitable. They also established 3 guiding principles that sort of lead to the recommendations throughout the plan. One was racial equity. It was identified as a priority, recognizing that there were, historic local and national housing policies that really, as James mentioned, led to segregation of many neighborhoods, and a lot of that persists today. We also know there are a lot of displacement issues that are driven by development pressures in a lot of areas in Charlottesville. The second guiding principle is regional collaboration. You saw on the maps how Charlottesville sits within the county. Housing doesn't see those borders, right, on the ground. It doesn't know that it exists. The need for housing doesn't really recognize borders. It's a regional issue, and we heard that not only from leadership throughout the process, but also from a lot of community members. Everyone really recognizes housing needs to be solved with multiple people involved. So the housing plan looks to sort of strengthen those partnerships, with UVA and with the county as this moves forward. And the final guiding principle was having a comprehensive approach. This really is getting at the fact that there's no silver bullet to address housing needs, that you really need to address land use, subsidies, tenants' rights, and other factors if you really want a successful housing strategy. So, though there were a lot of recommendations in the Affordable Housing Plan, that document had 3 major initiatives in it that I want to walk through. One is that the city should dedicate $10 million annually to affordable housing for at least 10 years. And you can see in the table here, the allocation that council sort of confirmed with the adoption of the plan. In the dark purple row, you can see that 50% of that 10 million is targeted to serve those with incomes at 30% AMI or below. A second recommendation was to build inclusive governance at all levels, and the intent with that is to ensure that the implementation of this plan is equitable and efficient. And then lastly, and really importantly, today's discussion, there's a recommendation to adopt progressive and inclusionary zoning reforms. So the plan was approved in March 2021. And like I said, that really set the stage for many of the land use and zoning changes that came up as part of the comp plan and the zoning rewrite. But the overarching land use recommendation that we were looking at as we moved forward with the other plans was that Charlottesville should revise its regulations and development approval processes to increase the supply of housing and slow the increase in housing costs while protecting lower income and other marginalized communities. So as part of this, some of the key land use and zoning factors we were looking at included changing zoning and development processes to increase the production of multifamily housing and expand by right development. We also looked at allowing more what we called soft density or missing middle in the zoning in those neighborhoods that right now are really single family neighborhoods, while also looking at ways to limit displacement of those communities. It recommended increasing the flexibility to permit more accessory dwelling unit development and provide funding to support that. And then to create a mandatory inclusionary zoning policy to increase the production of affordable homes as part of new development. So you can see there were a lot of housing and there's a lot of land use and zoning recommendations that came out of that affordable housing plan. And you'll see that come out here a bit in the comp plan, but then especially when we get to the zoning piece in just a bit. So on to this second part of the CVIL Plans Together process, the comprehensive plan update. Again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, mostly focusing on pieces relevant to land use and housing to set the stage for that zoning discussion. But again, it really is obviously, as with any comp plan, there's a lot of topics covered within it. One thing I want to note was that in the final plan, the adopted plan, there's 5 guiding principles included within there. And the purpose for these principles was to identify the priorities that we heard through community feedback and other stakeholder feedback, so that we could really identify how these principles are tied to the different goals of the plan. I want to note that sort of the leading principle here was equity and opportunity, which is reflective of not only the city's intent when they issued the RFP, it was built into that process, but also it reflects what we heard from the community throughout the early visioning phases of this process. Like I mentioned, as with any other comp plan, there's a lot of topics covered, and there's accordingly a lot of different goals and strategies. But in order to focus limited resources in the short term, we propose 6 priority areas for implementation. And within those, there's 30 priority strategies total. And so the intent was for those to be the focus in the next 5 years following adoption of the plan. And they don't negate the other strategies, but they're just meant to elevate those priorities that we heard from the community and from our analysis of needs and conditions. You can see the top two that are highlighted there relate directly to housing. Walking back a bit to when we were looking at the draft land use map and thinking about land use in the comp plan, we developed a list of objectives to guide that process, and that was really based on analysis of existing conditions and review of community input and priorities. So as you can see, this is where some of those priority areas from the previous slide come into play. This is where they might have started from. So things such as supporting more housing options throughout the city and near community hubs and amenities that aren't present in all neighborhoods. So we started with those land use planning objectives. From there, we identified and sort of workshopped a framework for land use. You can see down in the corner here on the right, one version of that framework. And our goal with that was to identify a hierarchy of corridors and nodes. We had various iterations of this, and they were discussed multiple times with Planning Commission and Steering Committee and others. And this does not reflect the final future land use map, but we wanted to show you how we began to identify those corridors where we would want to see more mixed use and medium intensity areas, as well as other sort of nodes throughout the city. Before I dive into the final land use map, I want to sort of remind you, James talked a bit about the housing need in the city, but I want to show what that looked like spatially to reiterate why this is so important. So the map you're seeing here was made by one of Charlottesville's planning commissioners during the process. When we were developing the land use map, 70% of the area in Charlottesville where you could build residential uses only allowed single family uses. And you can see how that plays out here. There's a lot of diverse housing types within neighborhoods today, but most of these areas shown in the light blue are the single family areas. You can see also that the green areas here, they're not parks as you might think, but they're the higher density residential. Those are really concentrated near UVA and near downtown. This is another way to look at it, a little less granular than the other map. But you can see that most of the high density housing is located along the West Main Street corridor in here, or again, adjacent, directly adjacent to UVA and downtown. And this is the final adopted future land use map, which was adopted with the rest of the comprehensive plan in 2021. So I'll click back and forth a few times so you can kind of see how it compares to, what was on the ground as we're creating the plan and then what ended up being. You can see how those corridors, the mixed use corridors, start to pop out, both the light purples and pinks. So this future land use map really encompasses a range of land use types, as you can see here, and they're distributed throughout the city based on existing community development patterns, balanced with opportunities that were identified using those future land use objectives and those frameworks that we had created. Notably, none of these areas have a vision for only single family uses. That's, that addresses the goals we had to support more housing options throughout the city in all neighborhoods. And as you'll see, that was taken forth into the zoning ordinance. But it's important to recognize, the city will grow incrementally over time. This map serves as a long-term roadmap that has some options for where we think growth might occur or could occur. And as you'll see, it was tied closely to the new zoning map. So I have a couple more slides before we get into the zoning, but things I thought were important to emphasize. One area of concern that we heard from the community was the need to minimize displacement. This was particularly focused on areas where there are lower wealth or low income communities, as well as the historically Black neighborhoods in the city and other areas where there are underserved and underrepresented populations. Many of these communities are located with proximity to UVA and downtown, and have been experiencing development pressure for years. As we've noted, those are two of the key employment centers. There's a lot of desire for people to live close to those or be able to access those easily. So as one way to begin to find strategies to address this in the comprehensive plan, we identified a subset of what we called the general residential areas, as was called sensitive community areas. And these were the parts of the general residential areas that fell within census block groups that have a relatively high proportion of community members who historically are potentially most at risk for displacement. There's just one little subset of them shown here on the map, but if you go back, you can see there's some scattered throughout the city here. They're all unique. They'll need different strategies to minimize displacement and support wealth building. And you can see some of the tools here on the slide. This was just an initial list that we include in the comprehensive plan. They're not limited to zoning strategies. You can't prevent displacement just through zoning, of course. So the comp plan lays out a variety of strategies to build on the strategies identified in the affordable housing plan. And as you'll see, this general concept is present in different ways in the zoning ordinance as well. The last thing I wanted to note was that the comp plan really sought to balance several different equity considerations. As I mentioned, that was a sort of key goal of this from the very start. So some things we're looking to do with the future land use map to then do in the zoning ordinance was to look at ways to provide more housing opportunities, including housing affordable to more people close to amenities like parks, schools, transit services, job centers. We also we're working to increase the availability of housing in those neighborhoods that have single family houses predominantly, or that have historically had exclusionary zoning, or which contain, few housing options, few non-single family housing options. We also work to support community wealth building through additional small-scale housing options. And you'll see again how that was implemented in the zoning ordinance in the next section here. So that's a quick overview. With that, I will pass it over to Christy to start the discussion of the zoning ordinance.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to talk through the process of how we actually brought these high-level goals. We've done a lot of talking about visioning, setting policy in the affordable housing plan, in the comprehensive plan. A lot of communities do that. And if anybody has been part of this process, you know that the rub really comes down to how to implement these on the ground through regulations like zoning or development codes. And so I think that was part of the strength of this project is the fact that it was all under one umbrella. And so there was a really consistent conversation all the way through and understanding of how these policy goals are actually going to get implemented on the ground. So the first thing I'm actually going to talk about are not the strategies themselves that we implemented in the zoning code. I'm actually going to talk about process because, and I'm going to actually give you a PDF of great best practices of policies to put into your zoning code, things you should think about adopting. But ultimately, I think the success of this project is in how the process was handled, how we thought really strategically and communicated and educated and had hard conversations throughout the process. And I think that's what got us to the code that Charlottesville and James and his team was able to adopt. So I'm going to walk through each piece of this and really thinking about it in 3 discrete phases. The first, zoning diagnostic and approach. It's pretty common when someone's rewriting their zoning code, they think, all right, we need to diagnose the issues. And that was done in this code, but with perhaps a bit of a different lens. And then there was actually the process of drafting the code, getting it out to the public, talking about it with elected officials, and getting it adopted unanimously at that, which I think is a really significant testament to all the conversations that Jenny and her team led in that community engagement piece. And then knowing that now that the code is in place, the effective date being 9 months ago, what happens next? What are the next steps of, zoning is the first step in this process of building toward a more equitable future for Charlottesville. So step one, that diagnostic and approach piece. We really thought about this as understanding how to confirm these policy decisions that were made in the affordable housing plan, that were made in the comprehensive plan, and really understand how this is going to come down to the ground with zoning strategies. Anybody that's been part of a zoning rewrite understands that there is this sort of conflict that happens where we say, we want these walkable places, we want these affordable places, we want these equitable places, but you end up having these in the weeds discussion about how you're going to control bulk and mass, what the setbacks need to be, what the parking requirements need to be. And there's tends to be this disconnect between this really high level policy goal and what that means on the ground from a regulatory perspective. And so as we were writing this diagnostic and approach, we wanted it to be a really accessible roadmap of where we are, where Charlottesville is today, and where we want to go in the zoning rewrite. And so it really was a mechanism where we could bring these high level goals down to the ground. And we thought of it as laying this educational groundwork. And I think one thing that was really successful and important up front is we were very honest early on, even back in the affordable housing discussion and that plan and through the comprehensive plan, what zoning can do and what it can't do. Because we know that, as Jenny mentioned, zoning is not a silver bullet for affordability and equity. It is absolutely a critical first step, but it is not alone going to solve any of the issues. It's going to enable us to continue to work toward a more affordable and equitable place in the future. And so we were very clear about that upfront, because ultimately it can lead to really hard discussions if you overpromise what zoning is actually able to do. That also meant that we had opportunities to calibrate and test specific zoning tools. So thinking about things like lot coverage, setbacks, how do these really technical ideas either help get us toward our high level goals, or how are they creating barriers? And so we spent a lot of time testing these ideas, understanding what's on the ground in Charlottesville today, those physical patterns, and also having those political discussions with elected officials and bringing them into that conversation and saying, I know we're talking about something really technical like setbacks and lot coverage, but here's how that matters for implementation and getting these housing units actually out of the ground. And really, ultimately, that meant we could build consistency on the path forward. So as we were talking to stakeholders, local developers, community members, elected officials, we were all in this educational space and understanding how these high-level goals become implemented on the ground. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, I just pulled out a few pages from the testing. Here we go. So here are a couple of pages of what that diagnostic looked like. I know a lot of zoning diagnostics and audits end up being sort of an Excel spreadsheet of updates that need to be made in the code. And we really wanted to make this very graphic, very accessible, again, putting it in that educational framework. So we talked about what are these infill housing types? When we talk about neighborhood scale development, house scale development, what do these look like as real examples on the ground? How big are they? Where do they tend to fit on the lot? What types of lots do they live on? Do they make sense on? And we tested those in a lot of different scenarios, both on in-town lots that were more traditional development patterns, platted in blocks and lots with alleys, and then also on parcels that may have been developed, post-World War II in the 50s and 60s that had really fundamentally different development patterns. And we wanted to understand, as we're writing these zoning tools for these places, what types of outcomes are we going to get and how can we calibrate them to get at the outcomes we actually want to see. And so it meant that we could have a really clear set of recommendations, almost like a checklist, and then also on the ground testing and understanding how, as we actually get into writing zoning districts and these more technical metrics, what that's going to mean from an outcome perspective. We wanted to focus on that outcome. And the second piece of this is actually writing the code. And one thing I want to frame of how we thought about this, we actually wrote it in 3 different parts. So we took first the zoning districts and the uses, kind of the meat and potatoes of what zoning actually is. We did that first and had discussions with stakeholders, with community members, with elected officials at that point. And then we moved on to drafting the second piece, which were things like subdivision standards, all the site standards like parking, huge discussions around parking that I'll cover. And then finally, we moved on to the third and final portion, and those are admin processes. That's kind of the things that people tend to overlook. They think of as kind of boring in zoning, but what I will get to is that is fundamentally important for getting affordable outcomes in your place. So we really thought about this as a continuous feedback loop of balancing those regulations with reality. So we continued to ask ourselves, the city staff, the community, the stakeholders, does this drafting of this piece of code or this idea support our goals? Can it realistically be built? We were constantly testing these ideas, both from a physical perspective and a financial perspective. Can the city enforce this? Is it, this idea that, yeah, would be great, but how would we as a city even enforce that idea? And will it pass political muster? So we were continually trying to communicate these ideas, how they related to those larger goals, deliberate on if it's realistic, if it can be enforced, does it pass political muster? Can we get this adopted? And continually revise. So I think that feedback loop was really essential in bringing everybody along in the process. And to call back to what Jenny referenced, I think one key part of this is having a lot of those discussions and a clear vision at the point of the comprehensive plan where you have a future land use map. You can have those higher level discussions. A lot of those policy decisions were made. And so as we were actually mapping these districts on the ground, you can see if you squint, this future land use map and the final zoning map are really reflections of one another. And we actually shared the mapping methodology. Charlottesville is a pretty nerdy place. It's where UVA is. A lot of professors, people love methodology and data. And so we were really clear and transparent about that throughout the process of how we were making these decisions, and how these technical planning decisions were reaching back to those larger goals and supporting that and the why behind making these decisions. And so I think it was a fundamentally new zoning and development code system. We weren't translating existing districts, we were writing new ones. And that meant we had the ability for the map to really reflect the future land use map that was laid out in the comprehensive plan. And then finally, committing to the ongoing work. James will talk a bit more about this, but I think it is critically important that we think about these zoning and these development codes as a continual process. The code is the first step. And the first step in that is we wanted to make sure that staff, even though they were very involved in the whole drafting process, that they felt trained that as we handed off this code, it wasn't just something that came from a group of consultants, that it was something that they had a significant part in authoring and they knew how to use, because ultimately the staff is the one administering this. And so we did spend a lot of time training with development review staff and making sure that those internal processes for development review were making sense and they were being reflected in the code. Something else that James and his team have committed to, and he'll talk a bit about, is tracking the progress and updating the code annually. Markets change, cities change, and we need these codes to be living documents. And so understanding how these metrics are working, what is not working, what are barriers that need to be addressed, what are outcomes that you may or may not want. Keeping lists of those and tracking those and updating those annually really builds that collaborative environment. And then finally, saying that we need to adopt supportive policies to achieve deeper levels of affordability and stabilize existing residents. So that's that piece that Jenny talked about in the affordable housing plan. It's not just zoning. We also need programs and dollars that are outside of zoning that need to come along and support these, the progress that has been made, the foundation that has been laid with zoning. These programs need to come on top of that and build to that deeper affordability and stabilization of residents. So now that I've talked about the process and, again, I think that is vitally important. I do want to quickly run through what some of the actual strategies we achieved in zoning were. And, again, this is going to be kind of a laundry list because, and I'll share with you a checklist that I think could be a useful starting place for you and your community. But again, I think it's understanding your place, understanding the issues and the politics of your locality and how these different ideas may or may not apply in your particular scenario. So the goals that we were continually looking back to, and these were originated in the comprehensive plan and in the affordable housing plan, prioritizing equity, number one. Part of that was allowing for affordability. And I think a critical piece of that is, we weren't just making things really flexible. We also wanted to require great design because there were issues of equity are also tied into access from a walkability perspective, from a climate resilience perspective. And so we wanted to make sure that there were good urban design basics baked into the code, because that also supports equity. So it's that two-part. It's not only allowing for affordability, but it's also making sure you're doing so in a way that supports these other aspects of equity. Let's see, next, get the slides advanced. Here we go. So getting the basics right, I'm going to talk about 3 categories of basics that I think are just great to consider if you're trying to think about where to triage in your code, where to make updates. Number 1, predictability is a big deal. It's one of the more significant expenses. It takes a lot of time. Developers end up spending a lot of dollars trying to navigate processes and understanding what the requirements even are. So just first and foremost, having a user-friendly code that is easy to administer, it's easy to understand. It also means that you're going to get the outcomes that you want, because it's illustrated right there on the page. Oh, you want this kind of development. If I check these boxes, then I'm going to get through the development process. And then that way we can spend more dollars on getting more affordability and getting better design outcomes. So highly illustrated tables and graphics. Also, we draft in a plain language style drafting. So it means that, you know, a neighbor can pretty easily pick up one of these codes and at least get a general idea of what can be allowed on their parcel. A part of predictability is also limiting discretionary review. This was really important in a city like Charlottesville that is known for having some really significant historical resources. And we know that having that extra layer of architectural review, discretionary review, is critically important in protecting those resources. I want to make sure that everybody understands that. But in those areas that maybe are less historically significant, and you know, this tends to be the case in a lot of places, discretionary review just is a mechanism citywide, sort of regardless of, you know, if it makes sense in that particular area or not. And so what we did in this code is we baked in a lot of those good urban design basics into a by right system. So it's a requirement of the code. It doesn't require going before an architectural design review committee where some of the bulk and massing of the building may change, some of the requirements may change, and by that, the cost of the project may change pretty significantly and how much you're able to build. And so we built in as much by right system as possible. And something I'll also talk about is we built in some by right bonus programs to incentivize some things like deeper affordability and preservation of existing structures. Another piece of this too, and this ties back to development review, right-sizing the review process based on project size. Most cities have 2 streams of project review, one for single family and one for everything else. And what we did, we spent a lot of time talking about how to move that needle a little bit to allow those neighborhood infill projects that are the same size and scale of houses, but may have 2 or 3 or 4 units, move that into the lower barrier of development review that requires a less lengthy process. Some of your engineering may get reviewed at a different point in time, and is significant cost savings and adds to that predictability. So understanding where that line needs to be of big projects do need a different level of scrutiny, right? But getting that line right between sending smaller projects through a smaller, more predictable level of review, and then larger projects going through a different stream. And another piece of this that Charlottesville is continuing to work on are thinking about how the development code processes overlay with a lot of those engineering review. So things like stormwater, utilities, fire review. So once you get your zoning right, you will probably be unsurprised to know you have other things you also need to think about. So thinking about how these other levels of review start to stack on top of that. And another basic to get right, flexibility matters. And I know this sounds a bit antithetical to predictability matters, but what I mean by that is we really thought about allowing for more choices everywhere, and we baked in a lot of flexibility for different scenarios. So we wanted to make the requirements very clear of what they are, but build into the process different ways in which you could meet that requirement. Charlottesville has a lot of existing fabric, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't being overly restrictive from a form perspective. And part of the equity piece of this, we decided that residential areas everywhere, so all those previously single family areas from the policy that was adopted in the comprehensive plan, those would be allowed in zoning to all have a 6,000 square foot lot minimum. So previously they had different lot sizes, 40 feet wide lots, and everybody at a minimum was allowed to have at least 3 units per lot. So that was a big piece of the equity, was really just treating all of these neighborhoods the same. You have a 6,000 square foot lot, 40 feet wide, and you're allowed 3 units. There are some bonus opportunities I'll talk about. A really big piece of flexibility here, and this came out of the testing, we removed parking minimums citywide. So there's no vehicle parking required. This is a really critical piece as we were testing, as we were talking to architects and engineers, that it helps with stormwater issues significantly because you're not paving them, paving areas for parking. And it also really helps these smaller scale infill projects. So removing parking minimums meant that we got deeper affordability because we're not paying for a lot of this infrastructure. And it also meant that we have better design outcomes. It's more oriented to people. To balance that, we know it's a student heavy population. We bulked up the minimum bicycle parking requirements. So most projects, if it's a larger project, there are requirements for short-term and long-term bicycle parking. So it's getting in that multimodal transportation piece. And then because there are some pretty significant size student housing projects that meet a certain size threshold, so 50,000 square feet or larger, there is a requirement for them to have a transportation demand management plan to understand how those larger projects would affect the surrounding community. And then another basic that I want to cover is that feasibility really matters. I've talked about testing a couple times. We continued to test, evaluate, and modify the requirements, both from a physical perspective, but also a financial perspective. And this was particularly important because we adopted an inclusionary zoning, so a required level of affordability for projects over a certain size. And there's been a lot of research and some continuing discussion that it is very important to understand that impact of what types of projects do and don't get built when you introduce these affordability requirements. It changes the economics of a project. And so RKG did a lot of testing on that. And so just so everyone is up to speed with what the requirement was in Charlottesville, the requirement is any project with 10 or more units is required to provide 10% of those units at 60% of AMI, deed restricted for 99 years. There is an in lieu fee option, and that is equivalent to the cost to construct that unit. There was rigorous market research, rigorous testing that guided policy decisions. One thing I do want to point out on this slide, it was tested on different construction types and interviewing a lot of developers. So it's understanding how when you go from a 5-story building that's wood frame construction, the economics would work. But as soon as you jump up to a different construction type and podium construction, all of a sudden the economics shift significantly. So we wanted to understand how this requirement would interact with the limits that we're giving people on different building heights and zoning. And then the continuing commitment of the city to track and modify these policies annually. So it's, again, if you're going to put one of these requirements in, understanding, is it actually achieving the goal you want it to achieve? And if not, how does it need to be modified? We'll share this PDF, and maybe it'll come in the chat in real time, but if not, it will be available to you afterwards. But this is just a cheat sheet that we have created over time of a couple strategies that you can think about as you may be thinking about adopting some of these regulations in your community, many of which we were able to do in Charlottesville. And we've put them in 4 categories. So how to communicate and strategize about these issues, better lot standards, how do we think about those? Things like reducing or even removing minimum lot sizes, thinking about how you can be more flexible with the width. And then some residential standards, how do we think about controlling for density differently? So moving away from something that's less predictable, like a dwelling units per acre, and something that's more predictable, like a building form, or even a certain number of units on a lot. And then finally, better processes. I'll just reiterate, process is vitally important to that predictability piece, which can add significant costs to a project if you have unpredictable processes. So this resource will be available to you. A couple of new ideas that I do want to point out quickly. One thing we heard over and over again is these infill projects for them to be more financially feasible, they need to be fee simple projects. And so we introduced this idea. It's actually a new old idea. Cleveland, Ohio has been doing this for years, where we control for everything in zoning by the lot. So your number of units you're allowed to have, your setback requirements, the lot size, that is controlled per each lot. And then there's this idea that sublots can be recorded through the subdivision process. And these are truly just for the purpose of ownership. And what that means is if you get 4 units on a lot, if you look at the far left image here, it could be a single owner, or it could be a condo that is 4 units. That's sort of a typical orientation for how we think about some of these, missing middle products. But with something like sublots, it allows you to actually have fee simple ownership for some of these units and something like a cottage court or maybe a townhouse orientation. And so you're controlling for zoning on the lot itself, but you're opening up this option in a really low barrier way for fee simple projects. And that meant opening up for a lot of starter homes. And lo and behold, the very first project that came in under when this code became effective was a project that was proposing just that. And I think it was a good proof of concept because it is achieving exactly what the hope was. So you can see on the left, this is an existing lot, similar size to the one directly across the street. And so the one in the front, the right here, that's an existing house. It's on a corner lot. These are going to be the first ones that redevelop. And what the sublots allowed them to do, they could keep that existing structure and add 3 little cottages to their backyard. So previously they couldn't do much of anything in their backyard. And now there are 3 for sale small homes, which are a great starter home size. They're 1,300 square feet. And because there's less land associated with it, is a much more accessible and affordable price point for those starter homes. And the development risk is fairly low with a fee simple project. One thing we also did were these by right bonuses. So these don't have to go through a discretionary process. So all of our lower and medium intensity residential areas were allowed 3, 6, or 8 units. If you preserved an existing structure on that site, you got additional units. And if you provided affordable units, you got even more. I will say, we know that the economics of these affordable units don't necessarily pay off from a market rate perspective, but there are a lot of really active nonprofits in Charlottesville that could actually utilize this affordable unit bonus. They don't adhere necessarily to market economics the way a market rate developer would. And in the mixed use areas that have that IZ requirement, if they provided a deeper level of affordability, they got additional stories in those mixed use higher intensity areas. I do want to cover quickly a couple hot topics. So these were things that were discussed and debated during the adoption process. In those anti-displacement areas, so those areas that Jenny talked about as those sensitive areas, as we got into drafting the zoning, originally we thought zoning is kind of a blunt object, a blunt tool to think about anti-displacement. Zoning's pretty good at legalizing things, but it's not necessarily good at funding keeping people in place. But through the adoption process, there was a strong desire to at least put in a placeholder until some of those programs could be introduced. So the 2 programs that were introduced in zoning is this neighborhood core district area, this zone. So this zoning category actually allows for less base units. If they're not affordable, you do get a preservation bonus. But if you're providing affordable units, you can still get that full entitlement. In the core neighborhood corridors, there was an overlay that was introduced, and this was late in the adoption process, where there's a realization that these corridors adjacent to sensitive areas, adjacent to these at-risk neighborhoods, were also redeveloping pretty quickly, and a lot of the legacy businesses were at risk of being displaced. So similarly, the base entitlement was lessened in those areas, and then a discretionary process, in this case, a special use permit, was required to exceed 3 stories. And there was also a framework for community benefits. It was acknowledged that this is a placeholder until the next project can come in and really study the economics and come up with some better tools to address anti-displacement. And then finally, I do want to cover a couple topics that were tabled for later. And you'll see a couple of these that show up on that checklist. And, these were ideas that we originally talked about early on. And I want to say this because it's okay to not get all your wins. Whatever the matchup policies are that you're trying to adopt early on, there are going to be some things that get left on the cutting room floor, and that's okay. And so in Charlottesville, things that were not quite in the final adoption was this idea of neighborhood commercial. So there are tools for that in the code. It can be easily amended from a technical perspective when the community is ready. So allow things like corner stores, cafes, coffee shops in limited areas, in a shop front house form, in neighborhoods by right. Another piece was this discretionary review around corridors. So there just wasn't the political will at the time to remove this discretionary review, and hopefully it will in the future. And then environmental regulations. This was a big significant piece that needed a specialized look that was more in depth than what we were able to do in this particular effort. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to James to finalize a couple of our key takeaways and wrap it up so that we can get to Q&A.
Yeah, I'm trying to get, there we go. So yeah, we're recognizing that we do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and move quickly through these next set of slides. I think the main idea here is just recognizing that the city is always going to be a changing place. It's a dynamic place, and our zoning ordinance needs to be as well. So this is an ordinance that's oriented towards development. So we're going to be, one of the things that we have to track is what are the outcomes with regard to development? What are the outcomes with regard to housing production, and then make adjustments to make sure that we're still meeting our goals and our desired outcomes in that space. In particular, we had a strong interest in small scale infill. That was one of the ideas about bringing more affordable small scale units into neighborhoods. And many of the tools that Christy talked about in the zoning ordinance are towards that goal. We also have a lot of requirements that relate to livability, affordability, but we recognize that rules equal cost. So we always have to have an eye on the balance. And Christy did a great job of highlighting the types of analysis we did to try and make sure we stayed within the realm of what was feasible. And then there's a lot of pathways to waivers and modifications. So it's a by right, fundamentally it's a by right zoning ordinance, but we also have allowed administrative modifications. So just about any standard within the ordinance, you can get a 15% modification administratively from the zoning administrator. Obviously, we have variances, those are typical, and then we have a special exception process that is a process that does take you through a discretionary review with our planning commission and our city council if you're looking at a larger change or seeking a larger change to one of the requirements necessary to move your project forward. But we also recognize that as we go through this, we're always learning, we're always going to be adjusting, and as has been noted, we are doing annual code cleanups. We basically have 3 categories of code cleanup. Throughout the year, we are tracking items that come up so that we can bring them forward together as kind of one action on an annual basis. So those 3 categories are technical corrections, where there might be, say, conflicting provisions, or a number that needs to be adjusted so that it works with some other rule. Clarifications. This is anywhere where we believe the text isn't quite getting to the outcome that we're looking for, isn't quite explaining it well enough. And so we make a clarifying amendment. And then the policy amendments, which are really standalone zoning amendments in of themselves. Those are kind of the substantive changes to the ordinance that we might consider in the future. We have lots of upcoming projects. Probably in the interest of time, I won't read all of these, but highlight some of what has been referenced. We are going to be coming back to do a review and update to all of our environmental regulations, both those within the ordinance, zoning ordinance, and those that live in other parts of our code. We are also going to be bringing back the concept of commercial uses in residential. This actually did get a lot of political support, less so on the community support side, and we ultimately made the decision to put a pause on that and then come back with new ideas in the future. But yeah, lots of work for our department going forward. So some of the key takeaways. First, being very honest and direct about what zoning can and can't do. Zoning is just one part of the process of development happening. Zoning allows housing to be built, but it's subsidies, it's other actions by the city and other players that allow for affordable housing to be built in particular. And so being clear about that and being clear that the zoning isn't going to solve all of our problems, but is part of the set of tools that we need to get there. Avoiding treating zoning like a development plan. It's understanding, again, because there are many things that have to happen before development happens. Zoning isn't a plan of development. Zoning is a body of regulations for development that's going to be proposed by the private market over time. Part of our work that we did was a rate of change analysis to understand, to the best of our ability, that how the market might respond to this new zoning ordinance, what rate of change we might see in neighborhoods in terms of the introduction of new housing types into previously single-family only neighborhoods. So that was a really important study that helped move us towards the finish line. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. I think that's self-explanatory. Don't stop at adoption. We've also talked about that. We are already in the mode of continually testing, evaluating, and amending the code as we go forward. And then understanding that adopting a zoning ordinance is not purely a technical exercise. We can identify solutions within zoning that technically solve the problem, but if they are not politically feasible, they are not feasible. Until you can figure out the political issue, you're better off leaving those aside and moving forward. So thanks, everybody. And I think we are now moving on to questions.
Thank you all so much. We appreciate you joining us today to share your expertise around these issues. Throughout the presentation, we've been assembling questions from the audience. You can continue to submit questions throughout the discussion. We will not be able to get to all of them, but we will give your questions to the speakers. So if they want to answer them individually after the fact, they can do so. So let's get started. One of the guiding principles that you mentioned in the process was regional collaboration. Can you speak more on how that worked and particularly how it worked between the city and the county?
So I'll say two things. In the process, what it meant was that we had representatives of the county engaged on our steering committee and otherwise engaged in our planning process. And today, while the county is working on their comprehensive plan, members of our staff are engaged on a regular basis, talking with them about various provisions, various objectives that they've identified in their comprehensive plan. But particularly on the issue of affordable housing going forward, I'm going to say that's a work in progress. We meet with the county and talk about our shared objectives, and in various street areas, we are working together on projects, providing funding for affordable housing. And we're discussing various kind of individual ideas. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. This question is about one of your other guiding principles. Given the catalyst for this project you mentioned, how did the plan address racial equity as the priority in your guiding principles?
Take that or you.
So sorry, I was just going back to look at the list of guiding principles. Okay, so talking about within the guiding principle of equity and opportunity, looking at racial equity. A lot of that came into the idea of looking at what we call the sensitive community neighborhoods, which was perhaps not the most ideal name to give it, but the intention of that was to say these are people who, based on demographics, are historically sensitive to displacement pressures. And so part of the way that we found those sensitive community areas that I talked about was by looking at income-based data as well as race and ethnicity separately and together, sort of. And then the block groups that came out of that as sensitive community areas were the ones where there was either a high lower income population, a high, we'll call it non-white population, or a mix of those two. And so that was one way that that came out in the land use process. Racial equity also comes into play, I believe, throughout the affordable housing plan, which now that I'm looking at it, might have been what this question was directed towards. So my apologies if I'm confused that. But throughout the affordable housing plan, it does discuss that in various ways, looking at, for example, the inclusive governance for implementing the plan. It talks about having a balance of different representation of people on various committees. That's, I know that the racial equity component definitely comes into there. But I guess, James or Christy, would you, either of you like to add to that?
I'll just add that one of the things that I think was much discussed and recognized in the early stages of the ordinance was the way that frankly, single family zoning had been used to segregate the city over time. And while race is not inherently determinative of income and the ability to afford a single family house, we can see that the end result has been that our high value single family neighborhoods are predominantly white today. And so a significant aspect of this work was to allow a greater degree of housing development opportunities in all neighborhoods of the city, with particular note of those neighborhoods that have access to significant community amenities like parks and high quality schools and all of those things. So, so we allow a wider range of housing types. And again, those housing types, because they are smaller, because they sit on smaller areas of land, are inherently more affordable. But then when you layer on the additional subsidy, that $10 million a year that the city is committing to, and other forms of subsidy that we aggregate and use to pursue affordable housing, those housing opportunities we create can be translated into affordable housing opportunities in those previously predominantly white, predominantly wealthy single family neighborhoods within the city.
Thank you for that. This is a combination of a couple of questions, and so it's probably a multi-part question, so bear with me. It seems as though you've taken advantage of what was a bad situation and made the most of it. Can you speak to how people have reacted to the implementation of the plan and what critics have said about things such as eliminating parking requirements, and eliminating single family only zones? What do you recommend as the best approach for helping to shape public opinion around those issues?
So, we don't want to hide the fact that this was a controversial process. The adoption of that comprehensive plan was deeply controversial. The comprehensive plan spelled out very clearly that we were eliminating single family zoning. And that was very controversial. I will say that for the part of the city and our consultant team, a lot of the work there was just about being very honest and direct about these things, right? We answer questions when they come up. Part of my role was to be always available to go to neighborhood association meetings. And I went to lots of neighborhood association meetings. And I can tell you that many of the people I spoke to were very unhappy with what I had to say. Those were not necessarily comfortable meetings for me, but it was absolutely essential that I had to be willing to come out and speak and say exactly what we were trying to accomplish and the examples and the data and the backing that we were using to pursue the policies that we were recommending. And then, as we said, and we've said a couple of times, this is inherently a political process. So I can't deny the fact that having a very, very active Yes in My Backyard group that was very well organized and engaged a lot of people to come out to meetings and speak and show their support was a part of how we got across the finish line with a comprehensive plan that was unanimously adopted 5-0 in 2021, and then the zoning ordinance that implemented that plan and was unanimously adopted last year.
I think one of the pieces of this too that maybe we didn't cover as much, what was the engagement with the Planning Commission and how they really had a strong handle on the issues and actually were politically willing to go further than the council would have wanted to go, which created maybe its own set of issues for what they were recommending versus what council was hearing. But they did a particularly good job of connecting the high level goals with what it meant on the ground. And so there were a couple really strong data wonks, I'll say, on the Planning Commission that continually brought data, brought examples, and I think did a good job of connecting those in a political setting. As much as we want Planning Commission to focus on some of the technical issues, they connected those dots between the politics and the technical aspects, I think, really well, and it helped this project go through the adoption process a bit more seamlessly, although, not to say it wasn't controversial.
I'd say, I mean, it's not that you need to have policy wonks on your planning commission, because we don't always get to control who's on our planning commissions, but having leaders, champions who understand the politics of the community and who will then take the data and analysis that staff can also provide and marry those together can also get you across the finish line.
Great, thank you. Can you elaborate and give us some more information on any best practices or things that worked or have worked so far in ensuring mixed income levels in communities by either avoiding gentrification or avoiding concentrations of poverty?
Jenny or Christy, do you guys want to start on that one or not?
I'll just start by saying zoning is not going to be a great tool to do that alone. I think we'll just continue to say it's a starting point. And right now, I think particularly from a gentrification perspective, what we were seeing was, and this isn't unique to Charlottesville, when you're only allowed to build one type of housing, you're going to get the most expensive type of housing because that's what the market is driving. And so just by purely allowing for housing types that are inherently more affordable, that accommodate different lifestyles, even different stages of folks' lives, then you get a more diverse community just by allowing different housing types alone. And then it really comes in with that subsidy and the policies and programs that help to make sure that we can reach deeper levels of affordability in different parts of Charlottesville. And then also it's in the implementation of those programs to help ensure that all of those dollars aren't going to one place, not one project, to prevent that concentration of any one level of income.
And then, I mean, one thing I would highlight in addition to that is that was the goal of the income targeting in the affordable housing plan, was to put that out. It was committed to by council. There was something that's really concrete that says explicitly, breakdowns for targeted allocations, and so that was certainly part of the intention of that was to encourage mixed income communities. But I think a lot of it too in talking about housing and why we're doing that, why we're showing those breakdowns, talking about, aging in place, wanting to have everyone who works in your community have the opportunity to live in your community, reducing traffic. Like there's things that can come from having a mixed income community and having places for everyone to live in your community that can benefit everyone. And so that's another way I think to talk about that and get people on board with that idea, which can then support implementation.
As you all have alluded to, comprehensive plans and general planning goals and policies are overarching. What sorts of progress metrics or measurements of progress did you put into place, and how are those shaping up?
Well, I can start with that. So, and then James can speak to the implementation part. But in the comprehensive plan, we mentioned we've got the priority areas and the priority actions, but there's entire implementation matrix at the end of the plan that has every single action and lists who should be involved in that moving forward in an approximate time frame, which obviously shifts depending on funding and whatnot. But that was meant to sort of set the stage to track progress on that. But James, did you want to elaborate on that?
I mean, and quite honestly, it's still a work in progress. We are in a strategic planning process right now that, one focus of our work is identifying the right metrics to measure our progress towards the goals and objectives identified in the comprehensive plan. So, we're looking at, we're identifying those metrics, and then we're also putting together really a performance management system that's focused in on achieving those metrics. So we've got the comprehensive plan did a great job of outlining what things we need to work on, what our projects are, what our actions are. But our next step is making sure we're measuring progress so that we can course adjust over time.
Okay. Thank you. One attendee works in a tourist community where they experience growing displacement of full-time residents by short-term rentals. Is there a similar experience in Charlottesville because it's a college town? Did you experience any of that? And how did the planning and zoning discussions attempt to address that?
Yeah, short-term rentals are a significant issue for the city as well, both because we're a college town and a tourism-oriented town. Again, I'll put in a plug, come visit Charlottesville. Virginia wine country. So we had some number of years ago adopted an ordinance that that required you to be a resident in order to have a short-term rental. So there was a residency requirement. You could not have a standalone short-term rental in the city. Now that has been a very challenging ordinance to enforce. We actually proposed as part of this zoning process. This is one of those feedback loops we engaged in. We proposed outlawing short-term rentals entirely from most residential districts within the city, from all residential districts within the city. That did not fly. That met with a really powerful groundswell of opposition. And so we kept the status quo. There remains a residency requirement, and we are now engaging in buying software that allows us to better track the presence of short-term rentals, and particularly the presence of illegal short-term rentals, and better enforcement mechanisms so that we're doing a better job of catching those standalone short-term rentals where the owner of the property does not live on site.
And I'll share our experience from working in many communities, including Charlottesville, that has struggled with this. Zoning is a tool. It's not a particularly good tool. So, getting some enforceable regulations in there from a zoning perspective, but fundamentally it's a business license and property tax issue. And those are much stronger tools to manage a lot of the short-term rental issues. And even better if you can funnel those dollars, those tourism dollars, back into your affordable housing program.
Thank you for clarifying that. Someone has asked for clarification on the preservation bonus and how it's defined. Is it about naturally occurring affordable housing preservation, or is it tied to preservation of historic structures or existing structures that contribute to community character?
So that particular bonus is, it's not tied directly to anything that would be a naturally occurring affordable or any kind of historic structure, although that was a benefit of it. It basically was any existing structure that's a certain number of years old. If you preserve a certain amount of that structure, then you qualify for that bonus. And the idea being that existing structures tend to be naturally affordable, and they have the benefit of keeping a lot of those resources. There are additional requirements if you're in a historic overlay area of Charlottesville, so that's some of those discretionary processes that stayed in place. But we thought that preservation bonus could be beneficial outside of those architectural control areas to get at some of those issues of trying to preserve some of the natural occurring affordability. It's cheaper to renovate things than it is to build something new.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We're coming up on time, so I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to give some closing remarks. If there's anything you wanted to say that you haven't been able to, or if you just want to leave us with some words of wisdom for planners who might be facing some of these issues, and the daunting task that it often feels like when you're just getting started. James, do you want to start?
I feel like we've covered just about everything. One of the things I think that is a confusing element for a lot of these planning processes and these zoning processes is understanding, again, I highlighted before that zoning is not a development plan. Your zoning ordinance is not a development plan. I think even when you look at some of the lawsuits that have arisen that are getting hung up on the impacts of all this potential development, all that stuff, one has to understand that it's a body of regulation. It is not in and of itself a plan to develop every lot or anything along those lines. I had a citizen at one of those meetings I was at question where I was going to get all the construction material to build all these units, right? I'm not, right? I'm regulating how the private market develops property. And that's why it was also really important for us to do the market analysis we did that looked at the rate of change and showed that just looking at the financial feasibility in Charlottesville's market, we would see at most a 2% of lots in any given year turn over and be redeveloped under this ordinance. And that was leaving aside any feasibility related to the actual development capacity of the lot itself. And as we've experienced over the last 9 months, I can tell you that the majority of the projects that have come in for pre-application meeting with us, they've found that the lot itself presented issues that meant that it was not feasible for them to maximize what they could build under the zoning ordinance. It's very, very rare that someone can actually maximize what the zoning ordinance allows. So doing a impact analysis is not entirely meaningless, but potentially largely meaningless. If you're looking at it purely from the perspective of what the zoning ordinance allows on a per lot basis, because that doesn't tell you much.
I think just a couple of quick things I would say is, throughout this process, thinking about community engagement and talking with people and trying to get feedback, we tried to give summaries of large documents every time we could. We did FAQs. Some of the neighborhood organizations and community advocates did FAQs as well. Everyone kind of had FAQs going, but it really helped everyone in the community to understand kind of what was going on. Or that was our intent, was to help people understand and address questions. And I think it's also just important to, anytime you're asking people to participate in a process or review something, just telling them why it matters. Like what could they potentially see in their life that, that could benefit from this or be impacted, that can help, when someone's facing a draft, zoning ordinance or something, it's daunting. So just trying to make it understandable for people at all levels can help to build that support from folks who might otherwise not be involved in the process.
And I think the thing I would add, and we've talked about it a couple times, is emphasizing that the politics really matter. You're going to get a PDF of some best practices, and whatever that best practice looks like for your community changes. But when I think about what was really successful and allowed us to implement this project, it was that we had project champions that had power in the political process. So we had community groups that were continuing to show up and advocate for this. We had a planning commission and council that was committed to implementing a code that achieved these goals of affordability and equity. And to brag on James, we had someone in leadership on city staff that was able to navigate these conversations and continue to have conversations with community and be that connective tissue throughout the whole process. So having those strong project advocates that understand why this matters and are willing to get it over the finish line, even when it gets hard, is absolutely vital.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation and definitely you all have presented a really great best practice and a case study that all of us can learn from. I would like to offer my sincerest gratitude to Christy, Jennifer, and James for joining us today and for sharing their important work on these important issues. Thank you to everyone who attended and to the Maryland chapter of the APA for helping to organize this session. As always, thank you to John Coleman, who keeps our webinars running smoothly in the background. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted online. Only those who indicated that they require a certificate during registration will receive one via email following the webinar. Please keep an eye on your inbox for details on future webinars sponsored by the Maryland Department of Planning and the Smart Growth Network, including our next webinar kicking off Community Building Month in December on Thursday, December 5th at 1 p.m. We will be talking about libraries as community building spaces. Thank you for joining us today and have a great one.